Hello everyone, this is Scott, and we're going to jump right into one of the most foundational concepts in all of economics. This concept is called trade theory, and we're going to talk about trade because it's really important to understanding how the economy works. Whether we're talking about it as an individual, or as a country, or as a firm, trades are just a fancy way of saying a transaction, a sale, or it could be barter, it's just exchange. In order to understand this complex world, we're going to start to use a lot of models in this class. So we're going to explain what a model is and how important the assumptions are of models in the outcomes. Within this model, we're going to cover two basic theories. We're going to be talking about the difference between what's called absolute advantage, which was a concept by Adam Smith, and comparative advantage, which was a concept by David Ricardo, in understanding two thoughts about trade. And we'll explain the intuition and help you understand where economists are now. Within that, we have the really important concept of opportunity cost. We'll also talk about the PPF curves, the production possibility frontier. That's a way for us to visually understand what's happening with trades. There are going to be a lot of graphs in this class, so this is going to be your first one. And then at the end, we're going to talk about what we think the outcomes are of trade. And you could tell by the name, when we call it gains from trade, we think trades are a good thing. So I'm going to start off the course with a inflammatory quote. The point of college is to make you really think and challenge the way you've been thinking up to this point. I'm not expecting that everyone will agree, but I want you to get challenged in this course. The first quote comes from Charles Wieland's Naked Economics book, and it says, "The problem with Asian sweatshops is that there are not enough of them." Now, that's a pretty inflammatory quote, but he actually does a good job of explaining what's to come here. I'm never going to do this in the rest of the class, but I'm going to read a little bit more here, just so we're on the same page. "Every market transaction makes all parties better off." In economics, we think that's really true. If you weren't going to make yourself better in a trade, you wouldn't do it. Back to the quote. "Firms are acting in their own best interest, and so are consumers. This is a simple idea that has enormous power. Adult workers take these jobs in these unpleasant, low-wage manufacturing facilities voluntarily. I'm not writing about forced labor or child labor, both of which are different cases. So one of two things must be true about these workers. Either, one, workers take unpleasant jobs in sweatshops because it is the best employment option they have, or two, Asian sweatshop workers are persons of weak intellect who have many more attractive job offers but choose to work in sweatshops instead. Most arguments against globalization implicitly assume number two. Protesters smashing windows in Seattle. Seattle is quoted here because that's the location where the World Trade Organization had a global meeting a few years back. We're trying to make the case that workers in the developing world would be better off if we curtailed international trade, thereby closing down the sweatshops that churn out the shoes and handbags for each of us in the developed world. But how exactly does that make workers in poor countries better off? It does not create any new opportunities. The only way it could improve societal welfare is if fired workers take new, better jobs, opportunities they presumably ignored when they went to work in the sweatshops. When was the last time a plant closing in the United States was hailed as good news for its workers? So I want us to think about this for a second. People do a lot of things with good intentions. When you hear about sweatshops, you think that this is awful, and it is awful. I wouldn't want to work in a sweatshop. I wouldn't want it for my kid. But eliminating opportunities doesn't make things better off. Let's get to a summary here. So the end goal here is to recognize that having more options than less is a good thing. The more options there are, the more firms there are, and the more sweatshops there are, the more those sweatshops have to compete for labor. The more sweatshops there are, and the more places workers can choose to work, wages will have to go up. We're going to be talking about that actually in the next chapter when we talk about supply and demand. I want to be clear here. I'm not suggesting that sweatshops are a good thing, not in any way, shape, or form. But what I am suggesting is we often think about consequence and don't think it all the way through. Eliminating sweatshops is not going to be the option here that I think is going to be most valuable for workers and wages. If you want to increase worker wages, you're going to have to increase the demand for their services. You don't do that by eliminating firms that hire. So why do we cover trade in economics? One of the reasons is trade is the foundation of everything in the market. The market is based on the idea that if you have something that I want and I have something that you want, we're going to make that exchange. As we get more complex, we're going to be talking about money and other things. But for now, it's just a trade. People are better off one thing versus another. So if I'm thirsty and I spend $2 for a soda and Super America or Speedway sells me a soda for $2, I want that soda more than the $2. They want the $2 $2 more than the soda, we both benefit from trade. Trade has become more controversial in the last few years. Generally speaking, we've been moving towards more and more open trades, and we've been able to see the benefits of that. But that has not always been the case. Even famous Americans like George Washington was a firm believer on not having external trade. He wanted to be an isolationist. But from an economist point of view, we want to think about, why is it that you're likely not wearing clothes that you made? Why is it you're eating food that you didn't grow? What are those gains from trade? So we're going to go through an example. In order for us to do this, and I have to try and explain that there's a benefit from trade, we need to create a model. So a model is a formal statement of a theory. It's an abstraction. It's a way to simplify things. Just because a model has more detail does not make it better. For example, if we were going to talk about leaving campus and going to McDonald's, we may say, go out to the parking lot and you make a right, and that might be accurate. We could also say you go out the parking lot, you're going to pass 42 trees, you're going to pass 13 rocks, and that may be accurate as well, but it's not useful. So what we're going to do is we are going to abstract, and we want to keep as much detail that's important to trading and get rid of the rest. That concept is called Occam's razor. It's a way to remove as many of the details as we don't need and keep the ones that are there. It's part art, it's part science. So trade theory is really one of the first key economic concepts. It was brought up by Adam Smith in his famous initial treatise, and he lived in a time where the world was largely agrarian, so mostly farming. And he looked around and said, well, why is it that France produces wine? And why is it that Greece produces these olives? And he thought, well, a lot of trade should be based on land quality. And he suggested you should be producing what you're efficient at. Okay, so just real quickly, Adam Smith is considered the founder of economics. If you've ever heard of the term the invisible hand, that was attributed to Adam Smith. That was before the times of supply and demand. And he basically said, well, somehow the market is guided by this invisible hand towards equilibrium. Not exactly those words, but that's what he was trying to get at because he didn't have the mechanism to explain it yet. So when we think about efficiency, the one that comes to mind for me first is gas efficiency in a car. And gas efficiency is just miles per gallon. But more generically, it's output per input. So he was really saying, if you can grow more grapes per acre of land, then you should be growing grapes. If you have better technology, you should be doing that. That concept is called absolute advantage. And we're just going to say a country seems to have an absolute advantage in producing a product if it can produce it at more output than input than another country. This concept seemed to work a lot of the time, but not perfectly. Then David Ricardo came along. And David Ricardo said, wait a second, we shouldn't be looking at who has the better technology. We should be looking at who can produce something with the lower opportunity cost. Now, opportunity cost is the idea of if you do one thing, what are you giving up in order to do that activity? So we're going to learn trade by example. What do we need in order to make a trade meaningful? We need two people or two parties, two entities of some sort. They need to have two different goods. If it was the same good being traded back and forth, it wouldn't be interesting. We want to have two different sets of technology. Everyone was identical. It wouldn't be very interesting. What we're trying to do is we're trying to capitalize on the differences that people have throughout the world. And we need to talk about how many resources you have. So in this example, what we're going to do is we're going to have the United States and India. They're going to make computers and software, and each country is going to have 200 workers. The technology we're going to have here. When we talk about computers, we're going to say it takes 1 day to make a computer in the United States, and it takes 2 days to make a computer in India. It's going to take 1 day to make a unit of software in the United States, and 1 day to make software in India. I did software and computers because a computer is really worthless without any software, and software is worthless without a computer. So the goal is they want both of these. Special note here, I intentionally did this so that way, when you look at the United States, you could say the US has as good, if not better, technology than India in every product we're making. And still, I'm going to be able to show you that there is gains from trade here. So we're going to analyze the technology, and what we're going to do is we're going to talk about absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is Adam Smith's philosophy, so who has the better technology? And what we're going to look at here is it takes 1 day to make a computer in the United States, and it takes 2 days to make a computer in India. So who has the better technology? Well, United States. They can make it faster. Then we look at software. Who has the better technology? Who can convert inputs to outputs better? They're equal, so they're the same. So United States has absolute advantage in computers. They both have absolute advantage in software. So now what I need to do, in order to show you that there is benefits from trade, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, what would they have done if there was no trade? And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, what would Ricardo have said that they should do? Who has the lower opportunity cost? And let's have them specialize. Then what we could do is we need to find a range of prices where they both have an incentive to participate in that trade. Then what we're going to do is we're going to let them trade. And what we're going to do after that is we're going to compare the outcome of where they are after trade to where they would have been without trade. And if we could show that there's a benefit there, we could say, hey, look, there is a gain from trade. Step one. What we're going to do is we said there were 200 workers, and we are just going to send half the workers in each country to making computers and half the workers in each country to making software. In India, if you remember, I have up on this top right, the technology. It takes 2 days to make a computer. If I send 100 workers to make computers and it takes them 2 days to make it, on any given day, they can make 50 computers. If I send 100 workers in India to make software, each one of them can make a software. So we're going to end up with 100 software and 50 computers in India. In the United States, it takes 1 day to make a computer. So you sent 100 workers of the 200 to making computer and software. We're going to end up with 100 of each. In the world, our world output is 150 computers and 200 software. That's our starting point. Now we have to say we can do better. Step two, we're going to specialize. Specialization is going to occur where you have the lower opportunity cost. Again, opportunity cost is what you gave up when you chose to do what you did. So what we're trying to think of is how much, if you're in the United States, every time you make a computer, how much software did you give up? Let's calculate that. So we're going to look at India for a second. So remember the technology here. It takes 2 days to make a computer and 1 day to make a software. So let's pretend I decide to not use some workers who are making a computer and I want them to make software. Every time I say don't make a computer, I'm freeing up 2 labor units. Those 2 labor units I could then send to making software, and each one gets converted to a software. 1 computer is worth 2 software. Then I want to think about what's my cost of making a software. If I said, you know what, I don't want you to make software anymore, I want you to do something else. What am I giving up? Well, every software is 1 labor day. If I would have invested that 1 unit of labor in a computer, and each computer takes 2 days, I would only be able to make a half of a computer. That's my opportunity cost. Before I go to the next page, I want you to try and calculate for the United States what the opportunity cost is. It's going to be fairly simple. In the United States, it takes 1 day to make a computer and 1 day to make software. I'm going to say this the long way because I want to build intuition here. So every time the US makes a computer, they are allocating 1 labor unit to making a computer. They could have used that 1 labor unit to make software. If they would have put that 1 labor unit into that production plant, it would have kicked out 1 unit of software. So every 1 computer costs 1 software, and vice versa. 1 software costs 1 computer. Now we're going to compare opportunity costs. Think of it this way. When we look at computers, you can go to the store and you can buy a computer, but it's in some foreign currency you've never heard of called software. Do you want to go to a store called India where 1 computer costs 2 units of software? Or do you want to go to a store called the United States where 1 computer costs 1 software? You want to buy where your opportunity cost is low. You want the lowest cost. So the United States has the comparative advantage in computers. Now let's look at software. Notice when we're looking at these opportunity costs, everything is in terms of 1 computer or 1 software. We're trying to understand the price of 1 unit. It's not real easy if I told you 17 eggs is $1.87 at Walmart and 33 eggs is $2.84 at Target, which is cheaper. You want to compare apples to apples here. So we're putting all of these in 1 unit. How much is 1 unit of one thing versus 1 unit of another? In India, 1 unit of software is a half of a computer, and 1 unit of software in the United States is 1 computer. If you want to buy software, you want to buy it where it's relatively cheaper. India has the comparative advantage in making software. If we group the opportunity costs together and you look at what's happening in India, 1 computer is equal to 2 software, or 1 software is equal to a half of a computer. In the United States, 1 computer is 1 software is 1 computer. What is happening? Well, these are reciprocals. These are exchange rates. Remember, reciprocals is 1 over 1 of that item. $1 is equal to 4 quarters, and 1 quarter is equal to 1/4 of a dollar. These 2 units of measures right there need to be reciprocals. If they are not, you made a math error. So notice 2 and 1 over 2, and 1 and 1 over 1. These are reciprocals. So now what we're going to do is we're going to let each country specialize. When we specialize, we're going to say, you know what, India, you are better at making software, and you used to allocate 100 of your resources to making computers. Don't do that anymore. Send all 200 of your people into making software. United States, you're better at making computers. You used to send some resources to making software. Don't do that anymore. Shift your resources over and make computers. In India, If you spend all 200 of your resources making software, you're going to end up with 200 software and no computers. In the United States, if you send all 200 of your resources to making computers, you're going to end up with 200 computers and no software. If you're really observant, you'll notice that the world now has 50 more computers than we had just a minute ago. So now the world output has increased. So we know it's possible to make more goods, but can we incentivize people to make those goods? So at this point, there have been numbers flying around left and right. It's time for us to take a step back and visualize what's happened. In economics, there are going to be lots of graphs, and this is one of the first ones. It's called the production possibility frontier. It's a way for us to graph out what each country or person can make and what they can't make. It separates what's possible from impossible. Here's what we're going to do. We are going to take the United States, for example, and we know that they have 200 workers and that it takes one worker 1 day to make software and one worker 1 day to make a computer. So what we're going to do is we're going to put computers on the horizontal axis and software on the vertical axis, and we're going to think about what could we possibly make. So let's pretend that I'm in charge of all 200 workers, and I shift all 200 workers and I say, I want you to be making software. If I have all 200 of those workers making software, and each one can convert one software per day, I could have a point of 200 software and no computers. Alternatively, I could switch and say, nope, I don't want software. I want all computers. So I send all 200 people on the computer assembly line, and I could end up with 200 computers and no software. Alternatively, we could have our ex-ante condition and say, I want to send 100 of you to make software and 100 of you to make computers, and I'd end up with 100 of each. If I draw a line between these three, it will define what I can make and what I can't. For example, let's take a point under the curve. Let's take this point right here. Maybe it's 10 computers and 10 software. Is it possible for me to make that output with 200 workers and the technology that we have? Absolutely we can. Is it efficient? No. Matter of fact, that's what we call inefficient, because you could make that output with worse technology or less workers. You essentially have unused resources. Now let's shift to point E. Let's say I was your boss of the United States, and I said, I need you to make this point out here, 200 pieces of software and 200 computers. Could you do it? Well, you'd come back to me and say, I can't do it with the resources that I have or with the technology. If you just kept the technology the same, how many more resources would you need? Well, you would need 200 resources to make the software and 200 resources to make the computers. You would need 400 resources, but I'm only giving you 200. So at that point, you would say I'm 200 resources short. Alternatively, if instead it took 1 day to make a computer and 1 day to make software, it only took a half a day. If we increase productivity, we'd be able to produce more. Anything above the production possibility frontier is impossible given the amount of resources and the technology that's available. Let's talk about this a little bit more. As we had before, I'm just labeling. Our first point was if we had 100% of our resources to making software. Point B, our second point, was if we had 100% of our resources making computers. Point C is if we had half and half. What I'm trying to have you notice here is that there are an infinite number of possibilities you can use your resources. But the way you choose to use your resource is displayed as a point. So a point is an allocation of resources. The next point we did was anything beneath the curve was inefficient because you could have done it with less resources. And finally, our last point was anything to the right of the curve was impossible given the current resources and technology. Now let's think about this for a second. Instead of having 200 people making software, let's say I pull the last person out of the line and I say, nope, you're not going to make software. I'm going to have you make a computer. I would give up 1 unit of software and I would gain 1 unit of a computer. My rise would be -1 and my run would be +1. What do we call rise over run? It's the slope. The slope is our opportunity cost. So the differences in slope as that change is our opportunity cost. Let's talk about what we think is better. Well, if we start off with point A, 100 software and 100 computers, we assume that having more things is preferred than less things, because you can always choose not to use it. So anything to the right and up would be considered preferred. So we want to move in that direction, up and to the right. Down and to the left would be having less resources for. So our goal with gains for trade would be to end up in a point that is somewhere in the preferred region. Let's talk about changes in technology. Let's say now that we're able to make computers faster, and we're able to make computers in a half a day rather than a day. How does that impact the number of software we can make? Well, it doesn't. We could still, if we allocate all 200 resources to making software, we would still end up with 200 units of software. But if we put 200 units of labor into making computers, and it only took a half a day, we would be able to have 400 units of computers. So we would call that a pivot. And the term is, it's pivoting out from the origin. Notice that as it pivots, this is a change in opportunity cost. Now, every time we choose to make software, we are actually giving up more computers because it got easier to make computers. What about if it became easier to produce software? If it now takes a half a day to make software, we could make more software. We could pivot up. We would still only be able to make 200 computers, assuming the technology for computers went back to normal, but we could make up to 400 computers. That technology, or that terminology, is called pivot up. Again, it changes the opportunity cost. Now let's say it got harder to make computers. Instead of it being 1 day, it takes 2 days. Instead of being able to make 200 computers, we can only make 100 computers. That's called pivot in. You can see where this is going. The next one is, if it got harder to make software, it took 2 days or 3 days or 4 days, do 2 days, we'd only be able to make 100 units of software, and we call that pivot down. So we have pivot out, pivot in, pivot up, and pivot down. We can also have changes in resources. So for example, let's pretend the United States had 400 workers rather than 200. The production possibility frontier would shift to the right, and we call that shifting out. On the other hand, if you have less resources, let's pretend instead of 200 resources, you only have 100 resources, the amount you'd be able to produce would decrease, and we would call that a shift to the left. So now let's talk about going from our ex-ante condition for each country to specializing. What are we doing? We are just shifting our resources from one point to another. We're shifting from, in the United States, having 100 workers making software and 100 workers making computer to 200 workers making computers. And we'll end up with 200 computers and no software. In India, we're shifting from 100 workers making software and 100 workers making computers. They'd only be able to make 50 computers to all 200 workers making software. And we'd end up with 200 software and no computers. We're just specializing, which means we're going to go to one particular extreme. So we started off by talking about what technology does India and the United States have. We talked about who has better technology, which was absolute advantage. We talked about comparative advantage, which was who has the lower opportunity cost. And what we did was we switched to production possibility frontier and said, what does this look like graphically? Now, if you remember, when each country was not trading, we ended up with 150 of one item and 200 of the other. And when we said, you know what, if we let each country specialize, we can get to 200 computers and 200 software. Now what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, what are the terms of trade that can incentivize both people or both countries to get to where they want? So what we're going to do here is we are going to look at each country's opportunity costs. So when we look at the opportunity cost of computers, every time India makes a computer, they're giving up the opportunity to make 2 pieces of software. Every time the United States makes a computer, they give up 1 piece of software. So who has the lower opportunity cost? The USA has the lower opportunity cost in computers. In software, India, each piece of software costs a half a computer, and in the United States, each piece of software makes or costs a full computer. So you'd rather produce software in India where it's a half a computer. Now what we're going to do is we are going to look at one of these items at a time. And what we're going to do is we're going to figure out where will India buy and where will the US sell on both of these. So let's start off by looking at this top one, the computer market, on a new slide and look at it in terms of a number line. Okay, so I copied this over. Now, if we look at India, each computer costs 2 pieces of software. If, for example, someone was willing to pay more than 2 units of software for a computer, they'd be willing to sell. Buy low, sell high. It cost them 2 units. If I was offering 10 software, they could make a profit. However, if someone could come in here and offer them a computer for less than 2 software, they would rather buy it than make it on their own. United States. Their opportunity cost, each computer costs 1 software. Buy low, sell high. If there's anyone who is willing to offer a computer at less than 1 software, it makes more sense for the United States to buy it rather than make it themselves. If anyone wants to buy it for more than 1 software, they can make a profit. So if we look at the range where it's less than one software, we have everyone wanting to buy. There's no trade happening because if everyone's a buyer, there's no one a seller. If we look at the range where the price is greater than two software, everyone wants to sell. No one wants to buy. But if the price is between one software and two software, US wants to sell and India wants to buy. So we would say if the price is between one and two software, trade can occur. I would encourage you to try this on your own. I'm going to walk through it, but now would be a good time to pause this. Assuming you've paused this, let's draw a number line and figure out what India would do. Each unit of software costs a half a computer. If they can get it for less than a half a computer, they would buy from someone else rather than make it themselves. If they can get more than a half a computer, then they would be willing to sell because they could make a profit. In the United States, one unit of software costs one computer. If they can get it cheaper than one computer, they'd rather buy than make it. If they can get more than one computer, they'd rather sell because they can make a profit. So now let's align these number lines, and we'll notice that when the price is below when the price of a software is below a half of a computer, everyone wants to buy and no one wants to sell. When the price is greater than one computer, everyone wants to sell and no one wants to buy. But if the price is between one half and one, then you have a buyer and a seller and trade can occur. You'll notice that this price range of between one half and one is the reciprocal of what we found when we were looking at the price of computers, being between 1 and 2. Again, that reciprocal is just an exchange rate, looking at it from one way or the other. So what price will they actually come to decide? Well, that's probably for a more advanced economics class. What I'm going to do is I'm going to name a price and say the price is going to be X, Y, or Z, and you should be skeptical. But you should be able to look at whatever price I set and say, yeah, that makes sense. That's within the range of trade where they both have an incentive to trade. So now what we're going to do is we're going to let them trade. I'm going to let the price of software be 1.33 software for each computer. That is within the acceptable range of the price being between 1 and 2. They are going to trade 75 computers. So each computer has a price of 1.33 software. So 75 computers are going to be exchanged for 100 pieces of software. Now let's show the result of the trade. Where were they before? Well, the ex-ante condition was India was going to produce 50 computers and 100 software, and the US was going to produce 100 of each, and the world had 150 computers and 200 software. Then what we did was we specialized. India was going to only produce software, and the US was only going to produce computers. And we ended up with more computers in the world. Then what we said was there were going to be 75 trades. The US was trading away 75 computers because they only had computers, which meant India gained 75 computers. In order to get those 75 computers, India had to give up 100 pieces of software, which meant the US gained 100 pieces of software. So India ended up with 75 computers and 100 software. The United States ended up with 125 computers and 100 software. Look at the ex post compared to the ex ante. What do you notice? Well, India ended up with 25 more computers and the US ended up with 25 more computers. We found a way where they would both be better off. So let's graph this. On the left, we'll have the United States and we'll draw in their production possibility curve and we'll draw in the ex ante point of 100 and 100. On the right, we'll draw in India. We'll draw in the production possibility curve, and their production possibility curve looks a little different. They allocated all their resources to making software. They could make 200 software. They allocated all their resources on computers. They weren't as productive. They could only make 100 computers. Their ex-ante point was 100 software and 50 computers. Now let's draw in what specialization looks like. So the United States decides to produce only computers, and India produces only software. Now let's draw in what the ex-post looks like. The ex-post is after trade. The United States ends up with 125 computers and 100 pieces of software. India ends up with 75 computers and 100 pieces of software. Do you remember where these points were when we talked about the production possibility frontier before? That's right. It was in the impossible range. You could not have made these points on your own given the tools and the technology and the resources that you had. We moved to the right, which is an improvement for both of these countries. So there's no doubt that this whole trade is very confusing, and you may need to watch the video more than once. Just to recap the steps, in order for me to show you that there was benefit from trade, what we need to do was start off with an assumption of what would they do if they didn't trade. That was the ex-ante condition. And the ex-ante condition is just take half of your resources and dedicate half to each good. Then what we did is we said, let each country specialize. Now there were two ways you could specialize. The first way was using absolute advantage. Who has the better technology? That was Adam Smith, and that turned out not to be the correct way of doing things. So what we followed was the comparative advantage, was we looked to see which country had the lower opportunity cost to produce each item. Once we figured out which country had the lower opportunity cost, we let them specialize in making that good. After we specialized, we had to figure out a way where both countries had an incentive to trade. So we had to figure out a range of prices where both countries, one had an incentive to buy and one had an incentive to sell. That was the range of trade. After we figured out a range of trade where both have an incentive to trade, we let them make a certain number of trades. That price and the quantity is just something that I'm going to have to give you, but you should be able to be skeptical and say, is that a reasonable price where they both have an incentive to trade? Then after they trade, we look to see what their end output is. We call that the ex post condition to determine if that would have been possible for them to make independently. If it's up and to the right of the current PPF, the production possibility frontier, we know that would have been impossible to make before, and they'd be better off. So sometimes it's easier to understand these concepts in a non-economic situation. So I'm going to give you a quick story that's not true but will help you understand. Let's say I went camping with my 6-year-old daughter, or when she was 6. According to Adam Smith, I should do everything. Why? Because I am better than this 6-year-old in everything. I'm better at carrying heavy firewood. I'm better at setting up the campsite. I'm better at fishing. I'm better than this 6-year-old in everything. I have the absolute advantage. I can convert more output per input per hour. I can get more stuff done than she could in everything. I'm better than a 6-year-old. Ricardo comes along and says, you shouldn't just be looking at absolute advantage. You should be thinking about your opportunity cost. You should be thinking about comparative advantage. So Scott, even though you're better than a 6-year-old in collecting twigs, if you let that 6-year-old go and collect twigs for firewood, that would allow you the opportunity to collect the heavier wood, or to go fishing, or to set up a more challenging item. Rather than just telling my daughter that she's good at nothing and she should do absolutely nothing, I need to look at comparatively where she can contribute, and collectively we'll all be better off. One of the assumptions that we used in our model to simplify and make this a little bit easier was we assumed that every person was identical. We assumed in the United States, for example, that it took 1 day to make a computer and 1 day to make software. We didn't say that there was some people who were better at making hardware and some people are better at making software. When we assume that everyone is equal, our PPF is going to be a straight line. It's going to have a constant opportunity cost. That slope is consistent all the way. However, that's not a realistic assumption. Some people are better at doing one thing than another. When we look at where opportunity costs are not consistent, that opportunity cost will have a bow. So I want to show you what that looks like on the next two graphs. So here's a graph where we have a consistent opportunity cost. When we go from 50,000 computers to 40,000 computers, we are giving up 10,000 computers and we gain 10,000 television sets. No matter where we are on that curve, the rise over the run is consistent. It is consistent everywhere. That is different than what we have here. When we go from 50,000 to 40,000 computers, we gain 20,000 television sets. If we look at the rise over the run, we'll notice that slope is changing because there are some people who are better at producing one item than another. I hope this helps. If you have questions, please let me know. Otherwise, good luck, and I will see you next week.